On March 23, 2020, Rochester police handcuffed 41-year-old Daniel T. Prude, who they found running naked in the street. They put a hood on his head because he was spitting, and he claimed to have COVID-19. They held him down for 3 minutes, during which time he lost consciousness due to lack of oxygen. He was declared brain dead and removed from life support on March 30th. Joe Prude, Daniel's brother, had been the one to call the police, seeking help for his brother, who had been manifesting signs of mental distress while visiting him, and had been hospitalized the previous day and released. The autopsy report listed the cause of death as complications of asphyxiation in the setting of physical restraint. It noted the presence of a very small amount of PCP in his blood and listed excited delirium as a contributing factor. Since early September, when the police body cam was released, residents of Rochester have been protesting, calling for an investigation into Prude's death. Now, according to a Washington Post analysis of police shootings in the US from 2015 to 2020, people with mental illness make up nearly a quarter of those shot and killed by police. This figure doesn't account for people killed by police in ways other than by shooting, as was the case with Daniel Prude. So if we broaden the scope of disabilities beyond mental illness, the figures may be as high as 1/3 to 1/2 of those killed by police. And it's abundantly clear that police kill Black and Latino Americans at a disproportionate rate. Comprising 13% of the population, according to the Washington Post study, Black Americans are twice as likely as white Americans to be shot by the police and killed. So this combination of mental illness and race in an encounter with the police is that much deadlier. Prude's autopsy lists excited delirium as a contributing factor. Now, this diagnosis, while not recognized by the American Medical Association or the American Psychological Association, is often used by police and medical examiners to explain both the kind of agitation exhibited by people like Daniel Prude and their sudden deaths, often after police use tasers on them. Police who were involved in the killing of George Floyd invoked excited delirium on the scene, and investigations have found widespread use of this diagnosis both by police on site right after they've killed someone and by police departments and coroners in the wake of police killings. And it's used most often in relation to the deaths and the killings of young Black men. Are there historical sources to help us understand the power and purchase of this convergence of race, police power, and the criminalization of mental illness? My current research examines how white psychiatrists described the intersections of race and African American religions in the late 19th and early 20th century US, and how their racialized theories about race and religion, but broadly about race and mental illness, shaped treatment and the experiences of Black patients. As psychiatry was becoming established as a professional specialty, the system of state asylums for the insane was expanding, and African Americans were being committed to these mental institutions, primarily in the South, in increasing numbers and disproportionate to their numbers in the population. African Americans were most often sent to asylums from jails, poorhouses, or workhouses after a commitment hearing before a local justice of the peace that involved the testimony of a local doctor. Upon admission to the asylum, they were diagnosed according to the standard of the day, which in the late 19th century meant a diagnosis of mania or melancholy. Psychiatrists then attributed the illness to other causes, either physical causes such as epilepsy, drug or alcohol use, senility, syphilis, or to what they termed moral causes, which included things that they described as religious excitement, domestic trouble, overwork, or financial embarrassment. And moral causes were those that could potentially be cured by a change of environment, and admission to the hospital was meant to serve that purpose. These were large institutions that had farms and laundries and shops for producing and repairing shoes and clothes, and in which Black patients bore the burden of the labor. White Southern asylum doctors claimed special expertise from their experience in treating Black patients, and they gave lectures, participated in conferences, and published studies in the most prominent psychiatric journals, arguing that African Americans were suffering a dramatic increase in mental illness because they could not manage freedom. Freedom, these doctors insisted, allowed African Americans' emotions to run unchecked without the constraints of what these doctors insisted had been the beneficial environment of slavery. And freedom unleashed what they argued was innate superstition and religious and political fanaticism. Such arguments had roots earlier in the 19th century with Louisiana's physician Samuel A. Cartwright's claim in 1851 that he had identified, quote, the disease causing Negroes to run away, end quote, which he called Drapetomania, and saw as, quote, a disease peculiar to the Negro, affecting both mind and body, end quote. And he saw it as manifest in this, in destruction of property, disrespect for property, and stealing, including the stealing of the property of their own bodies, running away. Cartwright turned to the Bible to understand the source and the cure for this disease. Referencing Noah's curse on Canaan in Genesis, he argued that, quote, to submit, to bend the knee, end quote, was Black people's divinely ordained status, and that any liberties would result in cases of drapetomania developing. And he proposed vigorous whipping as the appropriate treatment. By the end of the 19th century, in the aftermath of slavery, white psychiatrists' arguments about African Americans' racial predisposition to certain sorts of excitements, excesses, fanaticism, disorderliness shaped how police, judges, and doctors interpreted the behavior of African Americans at home, in schools, at church, at work, on the street, in the nightclub, and the forms of treatment to which they were subjected, from labor to lobotomy to sterilization. Since the 1970s, the closures of mental hospitals and the process of deinstitutionalization, coinciding with the rise of mass incarceration, has made America's jails and prisons the sites where the mentally ill are housed and without adequate treatment. Black Lives Matter's activist Patrisse Cullors is among those who spearheaded California's Measure R, which was approved in March, and focused in part on addressing the criminalization of mental illness and seeking appropriate treatment instead. So we see a through line from 19th century conceptions of Black excess as and inability to manage the self and community through to the criminalization of mental illness and mass incarceration of the mentally ill today. I'll leave you with the words of Joe Prude, Daniel Prude's brother, who said, "I didn't call them to come help my brother die. I called them to come help my brother get some help."